including its social impact work from coast to coast. And prior to that, she worked at Elevate, which is an organization focused on uniting Canada's innovators to solve society's greatest challenges. We also have Peggy Nash, who is a senior advisor with the Faculty of Arts and the Center for Labor Management Relations at Ryerson or X University. She is also the co-founder of the Women in the House program, where she teaches about women, politics, and public life. She's a former member of Parliament and served as official opposition finance critic. And prior to that, she was a senior negotiator for Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. And she's also a member of the Order Canada. So thank you all for being here. It's an interesting week, I think, as we all know, in terms of some of the reforms that are rolling out at the provincial level. And of course, the past 2 years have been really, I think, monumental and formative when it comes to our thinking around workers' rights and certainly for many people, a very disruptive 2 years. So I want to start by just sort of a scene setting question, asking each of you to actually set out how you envision workers' rights and what you think the most important challenge facing workers in this moment is. And let's start with you, Dina.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I agree. This is an incredibly timely conversation. I mean, for the last 20 years, I've been working, like in my work as around labor rights, I've been working with workers who have been excluded from labor protections because they work through temp agencies or through subcontracting or misclassification. And the biggest thread that sort of runs through all of those workers' experiences in the labor market is that they're being excluded from basic protections. So basic employment standards, minimum wage, overtime, public holiday pay, vacation pay, the ability to do something if they're not paid or if something goes wrong, protection around injuries at work, human rights, having protection like employment insurance, having contributions to the pension plan, all of those fundamental things that support us as workers. And I think that, the thread that I've seen has been employers trying to divest their responsibility for having a workforce. And so that has been through, companies hiring workers through temp agencies, companies hiring workers as independent contractors, companies misclassifying workers and telling them they're self-employed when in fact their fundamental day-to-day reality is as an employee, and all of the ways in which companies don't want to actually take responsibility for their workforce. And so I would say that the biggest issue for workers is to just really simply, and in some ways it's kind of hard to imagine, but that people just need basic protection. They need to be termed as employees. They need to have a basic floor of standards and rights, and they need to be able to use the government administrative program when something happens to them. And I think during the pandemic, it's been so crystal clear that, people's rights and protections and health is absolutely linked to each one of us in the community. And so if the person bringing me my meal is not healthy, that impacts me. If the grocery store worker is not does not have the proper protections, that impacts me. And so I think to sort of, just to reiterate this point, it is such a basic issue, but it's just having the same rights and having a strong floor of basic employment standards protection and the ability to have a voice and to do something if their rights are violated. And that is really what we're really fundamentally talking about, whether it's someone who works for Uber or Skip the Dishes or works for Amazon or Canadian Tire. That's what workers want.
Let me throw it over to Laura at Uber and ask her, from your perspective, what do you see as the greatest challenges facing workers in this moment?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with the other panelists. I think that the biggest challenge facing everyone is just innovation in this space, and government struggling to catch up to that innovation. The reality is that the way that people are working, the way people want to work is changing. We are seeing individuals who are taking advantage of flexible earning opportunities on top of their other responsibilities. So whether they're a student or a stay-at-home parent or a caregiver, or they work elsewhere full time, but are looking to earn extra, whether it's because they have a shortfall in a given month, or they're trying to save up for a goal or a dream. And so I think for us, it's really around the fact that innovation and technology has been wonderful in so many ways. But how can government work with labor and industry to try to modernize our laws around this? And I agree with Dina in terms of there should be a set of standards. We recently announced an agreement with UFCW, which is Canada's largest private sector union, where we kind of laid out a set of standards that were created based on what we heard from drivers and delivery people, and in terms of what they want. And what we hear that they want is they want to protect the flexibility that's inherent to the work that allows them to unlock additional earnings, but they do want some additional protections and benefits as well. So I think the struggle really is for government to understand that innovation is here, technology is here, the way people are working is changing. So how do they ensure that there is a set of standards for this new way of working and addresses what drivers and delivery people tell us they need, which is protecting flexibility, and at the same time having access to new benefits and protections.
Peggy, you have been involved representing workers in different capacities for many years, including as a part of the labor movement. So I'm curious for your thoughts on this question of what the most pressing challenge for workers is right now.
Well, I think Dina laid out a lot of very specific issues that I agree are quite important. Stepping back and looking at it a bit, I think what we see is a growing gap between productivity and incomes for the vast majority of people. We see rising productivity, growing profits, sometimes in extreme cases, growing wealth, and yet the average person seems to be stuck. They're feeling it now in terms of inflation, but I would argue that far too many people live paycheck to paycheck. In fact, often they don't make it to the next paycheck, and far from seeing app-based work or this kind of precarious work as a technological innovation. In my view, it is about rolling back the clock, not to the 20th century, but in fact to the 19th century, where workers had no rights, no social protections. They were at the whim, really, of the employer. They had to grab whatever they could get when what they really needed was a decent job with decent wages to support themselves and their families, and some social protections if they became unemployed or injured or ill or old. And the fact that so many workers today don't have access to these basic protections and have so little voice or control over their working conditions, over their lives, to me is a great tragedy that unions are struggling to try to come to grips with, and that I think governments really do have the power to come to grips with, but sadly, in most cases, do not.
And Daniel, lastly, we'll come to you. We've talked about app-based work, and I'm going to ask some specific questions about that in a moment, but obviously your members represent all sorts of different industries and businesses. So what are your thoughts on some of the biggest challenges that their workers are facing?
Well, thanks, Sarah, for the question. And if I could just build off of some of the comments that have been already made, which is, from our perspective, the sharing economy has provided incredible flexibility for a variety of workers, seasonal, student, temporary, unemployed, the stay-at-home parent, the semi-retired, and people looking to make money on their own terms. But there are corners of the sharing economy that have created a permanent labor market. And these were originally envisioned perhaps as side gigs, and now it's come to full-time work for many workers. And this is something that needs to be both navigated by individual businesses and their workers, kind of depending on that specific business model. But more broadly, the point I'd like to make is that the sharing economy has exposed and highlighted existing challenges with a social safety net that was essentially created 60 years ago for a very different economy and a very different type of work that didn't exist back then. Independent contractors, the self-employed, and similar workers essentially aren't recognized or covered by the appropriate or necessary welfare programs. So, I think there are many ways the government can address this. Ultimately, we do need to also modernize our social safety net to match the type of work that's happening today. And it's worth noting that there have been some efforts in this regard. The federal government is in the midst right now of comprehensive consultations and a reform of employment insurance to modernize our EI system. And I think packages like the one that Uber put forward very recently is another example of how companies can keep the flexibility that gig workers really appreciate, while also providing some of those basic rights and protections and benefits that Dina mentioned as well.
Well, let's get into the specific reforms that we learned about this week at the provincial level. A new proposed act that would provide minimum wage or mandate minimum wage for gig workers during engaged time. So that's the time that they are actively making a delivery, and also require some transparency from app companies around algorithmic decisions. So pay structure, performance rating, things that we hear from couriers impact their ability to make a living. So Dina, what are your thoughts on what's been put forward this week? Does it go far enough? Does it hit the mark?
Well, it absolutely does not hit the mark. I mean, I think, again, we're really just talking about basic employment standards. I mean, the fact that the government announced that, oh, wow, workers will get minimum wage as if this was a major accomplishment was kind of shocking. I mean, these are minimum wage standards, but absolutely when the devil is in the details, as you said, like, if you're only paying workers for engaged time, I mean, basically what you're looking at is absolutely not even $15 an hour. You're looking at $9 to $12 an hour at least. And so I think that what it actually does is institutionalizes substandard payment of wages, and that's what is really quite worrying. We've seen this with personal support workers who do care at people's homes, where they may have 5 clients during the day, and they may have 5 hours of work actually within the home of the client, but they're spending maybe 4 hours traveling between those clients' houses, and they're not paid for those workers for that working time. And so, we have seen what impact that has had during the pandemic in terms of the devastation of precarious working conditions. So what I would say to you is that, when a retail worker is in a store and there's no customers coming in, or if you're working in a restaurant and there's nobody asking for a meal, you're still paid for your hours of work. So when that worker is waiting for the order to be done so that they can deliver it, why isn't that time paid? And in fact, when you look at, there have been so many studies in California, in Washington, in Massachusetts, in many countries around the world, where when you actually analyze the time spent, like 35 to 50% of a digital app-based worker is spent waiting for the food to be ready, waiting to deliver, waiting to get the instructions. They are on the clock, they are working, they should be paid for that work. And what this legislation does, that was introduced by the government, first of all, does not allow workers to get the full rights as an employee. And secondly, institutionalizes substandard payment of wages and doesn't capture all of the work that workers do. And to me, that is actually going down a road, a very dangerous road, because then other employers are going to argue, well, my workers in a retail store, there's no customers, so why should I pay them? If, you know, the digital platform worker doesn't get paid while they're waiting for a customer, what's to say that my workers should get paid? So I actually totally agree with Peggy that this is going back to the 19th century. And what workers are actually saying fundamentally is they don't want flexibility if it means that they don't have basic employment rights. They are not willing to barter the two. And I think as people who are concerned about basic worker protection, we should be listening to those workers, and we shouldn't be exchanging flexibility, which is actually not in the workers' interest, and not exchanging that for basic rights. I think that's such a huge mistake.
Laura, let me ask you for your thoughts on what the government's put forward. Obviously, it comes after, you know, a series of consultations on the topic. What do you make of where the government has landed on this issue?
Well, it's a start, but it falls drastically short of what drivers and delivery people want, which is benefits and flexibility. As I mentioned, alongside of UFCW, we created a comprehensive package of reforms from feedback and research from those who will be affected most, drivers and delivery people. And what they've told us is that our proposed package is what they want to see government enable. 91% of drivers and delivery people in Ontario want the government to move forward with this package. And that's higher than the 89% of drivers and delivery people across the country who would like to see their provincial government enable this package. I think, you know, the government had an opportunity to enable a reform package, something that was, you know, more comprehensive, that covered a baseline earnings standard of 120%, flexible benefits fund, occupational accident coverage, termination pay, worker rights. But they decided to move ahead with less for workers, which I think is a little bit concerning, particularly when, you know, industry and labor have come together to say, here is some common ground. This is what we think can be the set of standards for this industry. So we were disappointed, and I know the number of drivers and delivery people were quite disappointed to see this development. I think the one thing I would just kind of say in terms of, you know, drivers and delivery people and what they're looking for over the course of the last 2 years since I've been at Uber, you know, all the research that we've done across multiple independent research firms, it's been very consistent in terms of what drivers and delivery people say. 86% of them say that they could not do this work if it didn't have flexibility, right? 3/4 of them say that this is something they do occasionally or on a part-time basis to kind of help with their other responsibilities and what they're responsible for, and that this kind of flexible work allows them to kind of fill those gaps because maybe they are falling a little bit behind. So the idea that you can just download an app and start working relatively quickly, I think has been a great benefit to workers. And we did see that throughout the pandemic. You know, in Canada in particular, we saw the number of signups on the delivery side on Uber Eats track the unemployment rate. So as people were losing their jobs, as people's hours were reduced, they were turning to an app to be able to kind of make up that gap. And I would suggest that that was actually a very good thing, because 3/4 of them said that they couldn't access government programs. So I do think that we have to think about this in a bit of a different way. And the last thing I'll say on this, Sarah, because I know there will be other comments on this, is I think part of the danger is in comparing this type of work to more traditional types of work. And so you'll hear that often. Well, if this was someone who worked in a retail store or a grocery store, it's completely different, because the reality is that if I am working in my local coffee shop as an employee, those hours are set by my employer. While I am there, it doesn't matter if there's a customer in or not, I'm expected to be working. So what could that include? Serving customers, mopping, putting away baked goods, like making the coffee, doing dishes. So there are other responsibilities. Whereas with this type of work, the analog is more, if I was working in my local coffee shop and I saw across the street that it was busier, and I said, okay, I'm leaving here and I'm going over there because I also want to work on that platform. I see that they're busier. That truly is the nature of this work and how people engage with it. The majority of app-based workers are on multiple apps. They're on Lyft, they're on Uber, they're on Skip the Dishes, DoorDash, and they're making decisions about where and when they want to work. So I think the danger is in, basically seeing this type of work and trying to draw that comparison, because again, it is completely different. In this realm, the worker is making decisions about the trips that they want to take, the deliveries they want to take. And just one last point of clarification, engaged time is really the time from when someone accepts a trip or a delivery until they drop it off. So this idea that they're on their way to the restaurant to accept the trip and they're not being compensated for the time, that's not accurate. And so I do think, again, the same thing around engaged time, and why is that unique to this type of work? So when I talk about innovation and the need for government to kind of think about this in the construct of different ways of work, it's because it is truly unique and different. And so we can't really be, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
I see you have your hand up. Did you want to respond quickly to Laura there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we see these arguments being used by companies like Uber to sort of, talk about how workers want this flexibility. But actually, when you talk to workers, they really, they understand that the flexibility is there, that is part of the digital app. They're completely well aware of that. But that's a separate issue from basic employment protection, right? So they are willing to do the work that's required. They're willing to work for several apps, work for 3 hours, or work for 10 hours a day. And the issue is, regardless of whether you work for 1 hour or if you work for 10, you should have basic employment rights. And that's what we're saying. And I don't think that there is nothing preventing Uber Canada and for other companies to give people the benefits that they should. Many companies, many companies provide benefits for their workers, regardless of what the government provides. And I think that if, companies are wanting to keep their workforce, they give health benefits, they provide pension benefits, they do all kinds of things for their workers. So there's nothing wrong to prevent you from doing that and giving workers the kinds of protection that they need. But it shouldn't come in exchange for not having basic employment rights and not basically having the ability to speak up and to sort of say, this is unfair, or I have been injured on the job, or I haven't gotten minimum wage or overtime, and to be able to be like regular workers and to be able to fight for your rights and have a voice. And workers have talked about this consistently, that they have no voice. It's just an app. They don't get listened to. They're ignored, and that they need the same protection as other workers.
This legislation was introduced at sort of an interesting time. Recently there was a complaint made to the Ministry of Labor by an Uber Eats courier, and in that decision, the investigating officer found that the courier was an employee of Uber. Peggy, I'm curious for your thoughts on the legislation and the decision, I suppose, at the provincial level not to address the issue of employment status.
The timing is curious given the decision around Uber Eats. And I know Laura will want to jump in there. Uber is appealing it, but the fact is this decision coincides with decisions in many other jurisdictions. We remember the Foodora workers who applied to the board to be treated as employees of Foodora. The board agreed. You ask what workers want, they voted for a union, I believe by over 90%. So I think that speaks pretty clearly to what workers want. Ultimately, they would like decent standards, decent pay, decent security in their lives. But you asked about the provincial government and the introduction of this legislation. I think we all get that we're in a pre-election period, and what governments want in this period is what other political parties want. They're looking for votes, they're looking for support. And will people say, well, something is better than nothing? I think that's what they're counting on with this legislation. But it's important to say what it does and what it doesn't do. What it doesn't do is it doesn't give workers full rights as an employee. These workers work, they do a job, they're working like any other worker. And whether there's technology involved or not, they are performing work and should be entitled to be treated as an employee. But instead, what this does is it locks workers into a third status. They're not an employer, they're not an employee, there's something else. And what this will mean practically is that workers will be subsidizing their employers to the tune of thousands of dollars per employee because of the standards that these workers are not getting, the WCB premiums employers aren't paying, the UI premiums, the pension premiums. These workers will be subsidizing their employers in their insecurity. And it locks them into second-class citizenship. And yes, there may be some retirees or parents or whatever who would like some flexibility, but they should not be sacrificing their flexibility by basic standards and rights. And I understand why employers are in favor of this. Of course they are. They're in the business of making money. And this gives them more control and more money. But I don't believe it's justifiable because it's simply not fair.
Laura, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, that would be great. I think it's just a few things. So I think, as you know, Sarah, when you reached out to Uber Canada about this issue, we are appealing the finding. It goes against many other findings from the same ministry and also similar agencies that earners are independent contractors and not employees. So I think that's the first thing, which is this is the first finding of this, and so which is why we are appealing, and we'll see where that nets out. I think the other thing I just want to highlight really is that on the representation piece that Dina talked about earlier, I think we do surveys obviously of drivers and delivery people. They're generally satisfied with Uber. I think we have fairly high approval ratings that if I was in government, I'd be very happy with. But the reality is that we know we can do more and we know we can do better, which is why, the first part of the agreement we have with the UFCW is around representation. So for the first time in Canada, drivers and delivery people, if they have disputes with Uber, they can go to UFCW free of charge and get representation services. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think it is a very important point in terms of how do drivers and delivery people have their voice heard. How do we ensure that they're represented? We're quite pleased to have this, and actually since the announcement, hundreds if not thousands of people have reached out to UFCW. They've already started to work on a number of cases. A number of drivers and delivery people have had their issues resolved because of UFCW's involvement. So I do think it's really important that there is a representation piece. So we hope to see other industry colleagues follow in this way. But I just wanted to highlight, because I think, we're in agreement in terms of, there is more that can be done. But I think a lot of it starts with, ensuring that there is a voice and those services available to drivers and delivery people, which is why we're pleased that UFCW can now offer that across the country.
I just want to zoom out for a moment here, because the word flexibility is a big part of this discussion. And obviously people have very different views on what flexibility means and who benefits from it. Daniel, I'm curious for your perspective on whether flexibility necessarily means perhaps a trade-off between more traditional, I suppose, concepts of employment or your sort of basic employment rights. Is it a choice that, or can these two things coexist together, that the sort of full suite of rights that employees enjoy under the Employment Standards Act and this idea of flexibility, and that people do want, the ability to choose shifts or choose when they're working?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a good question, and it's not one necessarily that there's the easiest answer to, but at the end of the day, I don't think these are mutually exclusive in the sense that, some of the moves by industry and ideas that we've put forward at the Chamber of Commerce is trying to marry the fact that We do know that these workers very much so appreciate and want to have and maintain that flexibility, but also want access to basic benefits and supports that come with employment as well. And so I think that's why, you know, you see private sector in some instances actually taking the lead on this. And rather than government figuring out a way to enable more of this through legislation, what instead was delivered on Monday, and I think, you know, this is something that I hope we can all agree on, is something that sounds shiny and nice and has been, you know, they're campaigning on it essentially as, you know, this landmark piece of legislation. But that $15 floor wage is not likely to have much of an impact on workers that are already earning on average well above that. The thornier issues that their own expert panel did consultations on and made recommendations on were ignored by the government. And by those issues, the stuff that's coming up in this conversation around worker classification or requiring app-based platforms to provide a flexible benefits fund. Now we are hearing that, you know, some forthcoming legislation on that might occur sometime in the summer after an election. But I think it's important to distinguish, particularly with this government, the rhetoric versus the substance of what's actually being delivered. And there's plenty of examples of this, and plenty of examples specifically within the worker rights category. If we get into some of the discussion around, you know, the right to disconnect legislation as well.
Yeah, well, let's branch out and talk about some of the other kind of big topics that have come up over the past couple of years. And I actually want to start with paid sick days, because obviously that was a huge flashpoint throughout the pandemic. Where we landed so far is 3 temporary sick days that workers who are exposed to COVID can use. And Dina, I'm curious for your thoughts on whether that is sufficient.
I mean, absolutely not. I mean, I think if any of us have family members or people that we know who have gotten sick during the last 2 years, I mean, we've seen the devastation that it's caused, right? And I think that if there was ever a moment that we realized that paid sick days are actually not a luxury, they're not some sort of like, you know, luxurious benefit that we, somehow can only get if we work for, you know, the highest paid companies, but is actually a fundamental public health and safety issue, right? And I think that that is what this pandemic has shown, is that workers need a minimum of at least 10 permanent paid sick days. And what we would argue, having gone through, you know, the first and the second and the third and the fourth wave of 10 days of isolation, 5 days of isolation, long COVID, that people need an additional 14 days to support them. And I think it's really important that this is one of the reasons why it's so critical that workers who work for platform companies have access to employee status so that they can actually get paid sick days. And so when you see some of the initiatives that have happened in other jurisdictions where, you know, the portable benefits are sort of dangled in front of workers like a sparkly little shiny toy, when you actually go into depth and look at what workers have to do to actually get those benefits, they have to work a certain number of hours, they have to make a certain amount of money, which many workers can't get access to. The other thing then is that if you compare the benefits of these portable benefits to what workers would get under employment insurance, under workers' compensation, under, you know, the pension plan, it is absolutely not even comparable. And so what is scary right now, and this is what really worries me, is that because workers have been deprived of such little access to any rights, that of course when, you know, companies like Uber, and that we've seen this play out in many jurisdictions across the world, when they sort of raise the spectrum of portable benefits, then, you know, people like, oh, thank God, like, of course I would love those benefits. But when you compare them to what you would actually get if you're an employee, like 10 paid sick days, if we get them, like federally, that's what we've got now as a standard, or employment insurance, where people would have access to $500 a week for 35 weeks or for 40 weeks, where they'd get access to training, where they'd get access to all kinds of parental, maternity, caregiving, all these benefits. It's like fundamentally absolutely different. And so I think that this is where we have to be so careful that we are not sacrificing so many workers' ability to be able to take care of themselves and get access to fundamental benefits in Canada, and sacrifice them for a sort of a sparkly, shiny thing that people are desperate for. And I think that is fundamentally what we're dealing with right now.
Laura, the idea of portable benefits was part of what Uber has been putting forward as possible reforms for I think over a year now. And I'm curious for your thoughts on you know, where the government landed on its portable benefits plan, you know, whether it goes far enough, whether it sort of mirrors what Uber had envisioned. What do you make of what the government has done on this front?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. I think, you know, from our perspective, a flexible benefits fund across industry is the better solution. I think, as we've discussed, what's unique about this app-based work is the fact that the majority of drivers and delivery people use multiple apps. So they're multi-appers or dual appers. So as I mentioned, they might drive on Uber, they might drive on Lyft, and at the same time they do deliveries as well to Scoop the Dishes. And so from our perspective, the reason why there should be an industry fund is because we believe that the hours that they work should be aggregated across industry, and benefits should be paid out on those kind of accrued hours. So as an example, if you were to work, you know, 10 hours per week across each of 4 different apps, you know, we would kind of see that and say, okay, you're, you know, at a 40-hour threshold, you should probably receive a higher percentage of benefits than someone who might be doing this work part-time. If you're working more than 35, 40 hours a week, this is probably what you do. You see this as the way that you earn your living. So you should probably have access to more versus fewer benefits. So our view is that as industry, given that these are technological platforms, we can work together, aggregate the data, and make sure that is being paid out on a flexible schedule. I think the other piece for us as well is in terms of like how drivers and delivery people want to use this money, because of the variety of backgrounds. We have a number of a good majority of drivers and delivery people have access to you know, additional like prescription, dental, you know, optical plans through their own employment, through their partners, through their parents, or through their university. So they see these programs and they say, okay, well, that wouldn't be additive. I wouldn't be able to access that. But if I could use that same money to pay for X, Y, or Z, that would be ideal. So, you know, our view is that, again, because the background is so diverse amongst the people who engage in app-based work, having a truly flexible fund where people can kind of dedicate those benefits to the things that matter most to them and that are not duplicative is the best way to move forward.
We know in Ontario, you know, upwards, I think, of 70% of low-wage workers do not have access to benefits through an employer. Peggy, is portable benefits the way forward, or would it make more sense to expand existing programs that we have, like dental care, pharmacare, and those pieces of our existing social safety net that would allow low-income workers in particular to access them?
Well, certainly universal public benefits like Medicare, and if you include dental care, pharmacare, I think these programs would help the most people and would be cheaper to implement. But there's nothing uncommon about having portable benefits. The construction industry does that now. You can have portable benefits, and there is absolutely nothing preventing Uber from getting together with DoorDash or Skip the Dishes now and saying, listen, for the good of our employees, let's get together and create this portable benefits program. They could do that now. But I want to make two other points because, I'm really glad Laura's here, and she is very eloquently upholding the employer's position on this. And I think that's important. I do want to make the point, though, that around representation and worker voice, there are a couple of essential aspects to worker voice. And one is being able to choose whether or not you want a union. So to have a vote on a union, that has not happened at Uber. And the second piece is being able to vote on a collective agreement. That has not happened here. So I do hear, Laura saying, well, this is what workers want. Those are the tests that normally decide what workers want. They get to vote on a union and they get to vote on a collective agreement. And it's people can be critical of the UFCW agreement. I think there's pros and cons. I think they're probably hoping that the union is hoping that this will give them a foothold in, and that in the long term, they will be able to represent workers there. We've not seen the agreement. I don't know if Laura would like to share the agreement with UFCW so that we can really get a sense of what they have agreed to. But I think that, there is a lot that employers can do now, but governments do need to look at, obviously, effective minimum standards. I do think the employee classification is part of it. They could look at improving basic standards, and they could also look at things like sectoral bargaining, which has been a focus of different jurisdictions, mainly in Europe, where if you have a certain density of union organizing in a sector, they bargain a minimum that applies to everyone. And then you truly do have worker voice because they are represented by a union.
We do have some questions that I want to get to, but I just want to, before we move into that, ask Daniel, we talked offline a little bit about some of the work that you've done around unfilled jobs in Ontario. And I know there in the business community, there is concern about labor shortages in certain sectors. I'm curious whether those unfilled jobs, from your perspective, will create an upward pressure to proactively offer those types of benefits to workers in an attempt to, ensure that those jobs end up getting filled.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Absolutely, I think it will. I think we're already seeing that in a number of sectors. There is appreciation on wages. There is an aggressive war for talent happening, which means companies are more upfront, pushing compensation and health and wellness benefits and packages as part of their competitiveness. So I think we are going to see this happening more and more. I will make the general comment, though, that I think too often in this conversation, and I think it's even bared out here, and certainly in some of the comments that are coming through as well, there is, it's very much so broken down into this dichotomy of employer versus the worker, with employers often being demonized in a number of different ways. And I don't think that's actually reflective of what companies writ large are trying to do. There are undoubtedly actors out there that are not doing their part, and we should be calling those folks out. But in general, we should be looking for areas in which we can work together and align around certain goals to push forward a progressive agenda where that kind of alignment does exist. The labor shortage you speak of, is not purely going to be solved just by appreciation of wages. There are enormous shortages, for instance, in the food and beverage sector. That's a relatively well-paying career, well above minimum wage. So it's not just that. It's going to require sector-specific strategies. We're going to need to increase immigration and ensure that new arrivals are equipped with the best available information for jobs that are in demand that match their skill sets. We do absolutely need to land on an agreement on childcare, where Ontario is the only holdout jurisdiction here, and that's frankly long overdue and completely ridiculous. So there are these other aspects. We should be reestablishing the universal basic income. This was a program that was being piloted by the previous government, was removed by this government before we even had a chance to understand what the net benefits of it might be. And making sure, as the last point, that supports and training programs and retraining programs are targeted specifically towards the demographics and people that have been acutely and disproportionately impacted by the crisis, so that we can have a more fulsome and inclusive recovery is going to be critical as well.
I see you have your hand up. So before we get into our first question from the audience, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of make a quick comment in response to what Daniel said. I mean, I think, absolutely there are some employers that are doing a great job. And this is not about demonizing employers, right? Like, I think we have to be really clear here. This is about making sure that you're not seen as the lucky one who gets to work for a nice employer, right? And then the other person who gets to work for the shitty employer, well, too bad, you got to move, right? I think that what we're trying to do is say, regardless of where you work or what type of work you do, you should have basic employee protection. That's all that this is really fundamentally saying, right? And I think that what we have to look at is the evidence of what we've seen over the past 20 or 30 years. And when you look at the evidence of who is working in what type of work, the racialization of the labor market, who is working in the jobs that are the most precarious, the fact that, immigrant women are making like 65 cents on the dollar. Racialized workers were the most impacted by COVID infections because they're in the most precarious types of work. And so then when you look at precarious types of work, you see what are the conditions in that work, whether it's a delivery driver, whether it's a personal support worker, whether it's a courier or a truck driver or a cleaner. We see some fundamental elements here, and that is lack of protection because their employee status is unclear, and employers are trying to misclassify them, use them through subcontractors, hire people through temp agencies. And that is actually what the evidence shows. There's a huge racialization of the labor market, and it's so clear what's happening, that there has been a deterioration of wages and working conditions, which is why we had such a terrible impact on those workers during the pandemic. And so it's our responsibility, our collective responsibility, to learn from the pandemic, to learn who's been impacted, who's affected, and ensure that no one can go below a basic floor of rights and protection, because it is catastrophic to everyone. And I think that is what we're just really fundamentally saying, is that, workers need that protection.
I have a question here. Throughout the discussion, we've mentioned, side hustles, multiple jobs, people who have, wear a number of hats in the workforce. So the question is this a sign actually that wages need to be raised if workers can't survive on one job? And Laura, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's definitely an interesting question. And I think in particular, when you look at the drivers and delivery people and their backgrounds on our on our platform. We know that a number of them are employed full-time, and they're doing this on top of the work. You know, when we ask them why, for some of them, it's because they need to bridge in terms of their bills. For others, it's because they're saving for something. So it's really, I would say, across the board. I think the other thing I would just generally say is just, you know, people are also changing in terms of how they feel about work and how they want to work. You know, I know that we specifically talk about app-based companies in terms of drivers and delivery people, but you know, when I went and I got my first vaccine, which was such an incredible moment, I'm sure many people felt the same way. And I was chatting with the nurse, and I asked her where she worked, and she said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, are you at a hospital? Like, how do you?" And she's like, "Oh no, I'm like a gig worker." And I was like, "But you're a nurse?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, no, you sound like my parents," she said, which made me feel old. But she said, "I don't want to have full-time employment anymore. Like, I'm not interested in that. So I kind of do contracts because it fits, you know, my purpose and my lifestyle and what I'm looking for." And I think we're starting to see that more and more and more, in addition to the other trends that were mentioned as well.
Another question here from the audience, and maybe a few of you want to weigh in, but it's about workers who are sort of doing piecework, going from gig to gig, and the person asking the question wants to know how this is an efficient or productive use of labor. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments on that?
I mean, I would just sort of say, like, I've been running a worker center for the past 20 years, and we have an emergency hotline in 7 languages. So we deal with thousands and thousands of workers from across the province who call around questions on their rights. These are mainly non-unionized workers. These are workers who don't work for huge companies and who have been in this form of precarity for a long time. And actually, what most people will say is that one job should be enough. I don't think workers actually want to work 80 to 100 hours just to make the bills, right? I don't think workers actually want to do a full-time job and then go and drive for 5 hours or deliver food. The only reason why people are doing that is because wages have stagnated so badly, and that the kinds of remuneration that you get at work right now have really constantly deteriorated. I mean, just imagine the minimum wage was actually frozen, has been frozen for like more years than it has gone up in the last 20 years. And so when you look at the kinds of wages that people are getting, when you look at the fact that, you know, $15 should have actually been implemented like 3.5 years ago, and it just went up just now, people can't make ends meet. I mean, you know, like the cost of a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto is astronomical. And so the thing is that what we're doing is we're forcing workers to work more hours, to be more flexible, to do all of this gig work. And in exchange, their health is being put at risk. And their people aren't getting a chance to spend time with their kids. They're not having any chance to spend time with their families. And so what we're seeing is this mounting anxiety and mental health and crises. And so that is why fundamentally workers need to know that if I work this many hours, I will get paid sick days. I won't have to argue for it. I will actually get access to employment insurance if I get sick, or if I get pregnant, then I'll be able to take parental leave and actually have a year off and not necessarily be at the whim of what gig companies decide to do. I mean, this is why we have a social floor of rights and benefits for all workers that is not at the whim of whether a company thinks that we are valuable enough to actually give those rights for, or if they want to do the right thing. And so I think that this is fundamentally what we're at the position of right now. And we also believe that if you're a part-time worker and you're working for a company like Walmart, who consistently keeps workers at low hours so that they don't actually have to provide health benefits, that is wrong, that you should be able to do full-time work if you want. Why are we keeping people at these arbitrary part-time hours? you know, we talk about flexibility. Where is it actually working for workers? And so I think that that to me is the issue, is that, you know, how do we ensure that the ones who are the most vulnerable, who have the least protection in the workplace, actually are the ones that are the most protected? And that means employee status.
Peggy.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, what a business model, you know, and it's not just the app-based employers, it's becoming very widespread throughout industry, whether it's industrial or service sector, finance, that this incredible downward pressure to squeeze labor costs out of the business model. Now, I understand labor costs challenge profits, and you know, but if you look at profits these days, some companies, and Amazon obviously is the big example, but some companies are making absolutely extraordinary profits, and whether it's in the grocery retail business or warehousing, delivery. So it really is so completely unethical to then rely on a grossly inadequate cheap labor strategy. Now, there are other businesses that rely on keeping labor costs low, and they may say, listen, we can't make money if we have to pay people a decent wage or give them sick pay or whatever. And then I have to ask, what kind of business model is that? If you can't make money treating people with respect so that they can live a decent life, then maybe your business model is all wrong. Maybe you should get into a different line of business. But I think that we're talking about squeezing out labor costs to the point that you lose any sense of cohesiveness in society, because if you know, you start by squeezing the most vulnerable people who may not have as much of a voice, but that squeezing continues up the ladder. And I would say, no matter where you are in the workforce, no matter what you make, you are vulnerable to that squeezing. And I would urge anyone in the labor movement to really consider greater social solidarity with those at the very bottom end at the economic spectrum, because that model is undermining and deteriorating all of our society. It's a very corrosive model.
I see a question from the audience, so I'm going to try and unmute you, Joe, so that you can ask your question.
Hi. Great comments by Dina and Peggy just now. It makes me think back to 1980 when I was on the negotiating team for the teachers in the Toronto District School Board, and we pushed for leaves of absence and job sharing and that sort of thing, which were family friendly and also helped women stay in the workforce. In those days, they often asked women to resign when they had a child. And that kind of policy, back to Peggy's point about unions, those kinds of advances spread. And in fact, that particular approach spread into other school boards, into banks, into government, into large organizations. And it's become quite popular in HR. So unions can not only benefit themselves, but benefit other groups. The other issue is workers' rights that we've been talking about here. And there was the first African-American economist was named Sadie Alexander. And she worked with Roosevelt, and she worked with Martin Luther King. And one of her strategies to reduce inequality and prejudice was to fight for the right to work for everyone, a living wage job for everyone. And eventually in 1944, and I'll put a link in the chat about it, President Roosevelt actually announced that he would like to pursue a bill of economic rights, including living wage job, affordable housing, education, healthcare. social insurance, all those things. Unfortunately, he got very sick and died, and that momentum was lost. But it did carry on into the United Nations. All that the Declaration of Human Rights very much reflects his work. And I think Sadie Alexander might have been a part of that team that contributed to that. Certainly Eleanor Roosevelt was. So I guess my question is, shouldn't we be fighting for a Bill of Economic Rights? If it's the law that you have to have a living wage job, that you have to have affordable housing, et cetera, just like we have other rights that we fight for, and which constitutionally go to the Supreme Court and have to be enforced, we could do the same economically. And if we had this predisposition for full employment, then employers have to compete for employees that get better benefits, higher wages. And it also benefits, I think, productivity, because it's a motivation to find labor-saving technologies, better technologies, more efficient technologies, because the army of the unemployed isn't there. So, why hasn't that happened? That's, it's kind of a big thing that baffles me. Why aren't we fighting for a Bill of Economic Rights and address these issues through the law? Thank you.
Would anyone like to jump in on that one?
I would just very quickly respond by saying, I think it's an interesting idea. It might be an idea that sounds better than it would actually be in terms of its impact. And some of the issues that you raised there, Joe, are things that require concerted attempts on behalf of government and businesses to address. And I don't know that having an economic bill of rights around housing affordability will actually increase the stock of housing to the degree that we need, so that workers can afford a place to live near where they like to work. And so, that would be point one. And point two is, just because we haven't spent too much time on this side of it, is that there has been a 2-year-long pandemic in which some sectors and companies have performed very well. Financial services, professional services, technology, these folks, generally speaking, have done well. But there's a host of sectors, restaurant, food and accommodation, retail, and demographics that predominantly work in those sectors, racialized minorities, new immigrants, that have been disproportionately impacted. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because, a lot of what we're talking about today here will have an outsized impact on our small and medium-sized employers. And we know these are the folks with the least amount of maneuverability in terms of their margins, and have been disproportionately impacted in terms of the crisis. And the numbers around this, if we're to look at a February survey of small businesses in Ontario, 33% of them are at normal or just above their pre-pandemic revenue levels. They are coming out of this, I say that as we optimistically, with over $160,000 of COVID-specific debt. 3/4 of them are experiencing supply chain difficulties, making it difficult to even provide their services when they're allowed. 9 out of 10 are experiencing a huge uptick in costs because of inflation and the rising cost of doing business. So I understand that this might not be as popular or as palatable as a perspective, but we have to acknowledge the fact that there is constraints financially on the employer side as well. And we do need to pick and prioritize areas in which it makes the most sense and will have the most impact to invest in terms of meaningfully advancing worker rights in the workplace.
Did you want to add a comment here?
Yeah, I think that what we're talking about, Daniel, is a just recovery, right? Like a just recovery for everyone who has suffered in the pandemic, and one shouldn't be at the cost of the other. And I think that, there are fundamental issues that small businesses have been dealing with that actually have nothing to do with labor costs, which is, as you said, supply chain issues, One of the biggest things that we saw in a report that was released, I think it was last week, was the issue of commercial rent. The fact that small businesses, the mom and pop stores, stores, the brick and mortar, are completely at the mercy of massive commercial rent increases, and at the mercy of huge corporations like Walmart that come in and then basically take away any competitive edge for them to be able to survive in our local communities. And we would agree that small businesses are sort of give the vibrancy and the community spirit that we need, but they are struggling because of these huge commercial rent landlords that are just gouging them. But I think it's really important that we make sure that we're not talking about businesses recovering at the expense of workers, and that, as Peggy talked about, what is the business model? Because if your business model is predicated on basically not treating your workers fairly and not allowing them to be able to go home at night and take care of their bills, then I'd say that that's not a business that I want to support. I want my money. And I think that we speak to so many workers and people in our communities that say, we want to support businesses that provide decent working conditions and wages. And in fact, that has become more important through the pandemic, that there is a growing consensus across this country that we all benefit as a community if the local businesses, but also if the huge corporations that have made billions of dollars of profit during this pandemic, if they are held accountable for that they pay their taxes, that they provide decent wages and working conditions, and that workers can be able to take care of themselves and be able to go home at night. And I think, with the confidence that they can look after themselves. And I think that is the social contract, right? That is the contract that we want, that we don't have to be able to sacrifice workers who are doing the lowest paid work for the profits of those corporations or for the small businesses. And I think that is essentially what this argument is all about.
We're coming up right to the end of our time now. So I think what I'll do is just really quickly ask each of you to share, what you think the single greatest piece of policy or legislation or change that could be put on the table to accomplish what we've been talking about here, a just recovery, and one that strengthens workers' rights. Laura, let's start with you.
Thanks, Sarah. From our perspective, I think that one of the easiest, quickest things that could be done would be to take a look at the Uber UFCW agreement as a first step, providing that set of standards for industry. At one point, someone said there's nothing stopping Uber from working with industry. I think sometimes government needs to tell industry that this is going to be the standard on a go forward. I'm not aware of any of my colleagues from other companies talking about these issues, being involved in panels on these issues, and having a position like ours. So I think, from our perspective, we really believe that, with labor, with industry, a good first step moving forward, that would actually almost immediately level up this work and provide more benefits and protections while preserving the flexibility that's so important to drivers and delivery people.
Peggy, what's the one thing that you hope forms sort of a central piece of a just recovery?
I don't think there's a private sector solution to this without government involvement. I think that our premier, if he truly wants to be a man of the people, then he should put on his big boy pants and decide that a worker is a worker is a worker, and bring in changes to employment standards that recognize that all work needs to be regulated by employment standards, not a new classification, and improving those standards so that people can keep themselves and their families together and live a decent life in our city, whether you work in service, finance, healthcare, industry, whatever it is. I think we all want to live in a society where people can have a decent life and where work is valued. So I would say improving employment standards that includes recognizing workers, not as a separate classification, but as employees, would go a long way. It's not a panacea, it doesn't do everything, but it would be a very good start.
Daniel?
So I guess in many ways, I think a silver lining of this pandemic is that it has brought to light and given more attention to issues that previously didn't get much airtime. And we're discussing many of them today. One of them is, paid sick leave. And so in many ways, I think it's brought worker rights and perspectives more to the public sphere and giving them more airtime than they previously had. I think it's important to build from that momentum. And one of the things, I think Dina mentioned earlier is around that perspective actually being embedded into the decision-making bodies. And, I think at a starting point, the demographics that have been uniquely impacted by COVID-19 or that find themselves in more vulnerable or precarious working positions need to be included in government decision-making bodies around economic recovery and around labor rights in a very concerted and genuine fashion.
And Dina, we'll end with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally flexibility can't come at the expense of decent work. I think that's what we're really talking about. I think we don't want to have a pool of workers that are made vulnerable by the type of work that they do, where they're competing against each other and the road goes down, right? The ratcheting of the wages go down. I think fundamentally, how do we raise standards and how do we ensure a strong protection of standards for everyone, no matter what you do? And I think that that's even more critical when you look at the racialization of gig work, of precarious employment, because if you don't understand the issue of who is impacted, who has the lowest wages, who is the most vulnerable, who is the one that can't pay their rent, who are the ones that don't have a voice, then what you are fundamentally doing is you're institutionalizing racism, systemic racism within the labor market. We've seen this historically where certain groups of workers have been excluded from protections like live-in caregivers, workers like migrant farm workers, workers who come and take care of our families from overseas. And so this is happening domestically. And so I think that this is why I'm really pushing this point is that, if we really want to tackle institutionalized racism and all of the issues that came out during the pandemic in terms of, who is doing these types of work, we actually really are, each one of us is responsible for what we're putting forward as policy, right? And what we're putting forward as the ability for workers to be able to stand up for themselves, not be told who they can go to deal with their problems, but they can stand up for themselves. Nobody makes that decision for them. They're not children, right? And so they need to be able to choose a union, choose who they go to, and that can only happen if they're an employee and if they have the basic same rights as every other worker in the labor market. And that is fundamentally what we're talking about. And if we're setting up a class of workers because they're migrant, because they're people of color, because they're newcomers, and we're saying, no, you can't do that. You only can do this if you want to deal with your issues, then, really, what are we saying here? This is actually a very dangerous road that we're going down. So I think that this is a moment for us to do the right thing. And so that's why I think it's so important for companies to understand that you can either do the right thing and ensure that there are employee benefits and employee protection and employee status, or you can turn your back on thousands and thousands of racialized workers and give them substandard conditions.
Well, thank you everyone for participating. I know everyone comes to this discussion from a different perspective and position, and I appreciate you all sharing your thoughts and your insight. And I will turn it over to the First Policy Response team. Thank you to all the organizers for making this happen, and for all of you coming out and listening. With that, we'll turn it over to FPR to say goodbye.
Thanks, and thank you so much to our panel. I thought that was a rich, enlightening discussion and super timely, and so appreciate the candor and the participation from everybody. And thanks to those on our team who helped make this happen, Seher Shafiq, Stephanie McClellan, Matthew Mendelson, and Zainab Chowdhury, and to our partners at the Center for Labor Management Relations and at the Toronto Star, Tegido Sara and Irene Gentle. And I also want to point out we have a column in the Toronto Star that we are co-publishing from Senator Hassan Youssef on these very topics, which we'll throw in the chat if you want to check that out. And you can also visit policyresponse.ca, sign up for our newsletter, and also find links, and you'll hear about when we have future events. Lastly, a recording of this event will be shared soon if you want to go back over anything. And many thanks for being here. Stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.